The day Della Wilcox rode into the town of Harlan Creek, New Mexico Territory, the summer of 1882, she had 43 cents in her coat pocket, a loaded revolver at her hip, and 2 years' worth of hard living etched into the fine lines around her eyes. And still, she was the most striking woman anyone in that dusty little town had seen in a long, long while. She had not planned to stop in Harlan Creek. She had not planned to stop anywhere, if she was being honest with herself, which she had gotten very good at not being over the course of those 2 years on the move. Stopping meant settling, and settling meant being found, and being found meant going back to a life that had tried its level best to bury her before she had turned 25. So she rode west, always west, because west was where the land was still wild enough to swallow a woman whole and ask no questions about where she had come from. But her mare, a sturdy gray animal she had bought off a Comanche trader in Texas and named Patience, because she had needed to remind herself of the virtue daily, had thrown a shoe somewhere back on the trail between the Red Canyon walls and the Flat Basin lands, and Harlan Creek was the first place with a blacksmith she had come across in 3 days of riding. She pulled Patience to a slow walk down the main street, past the general store with its faded painted window, past the saloon with its swinging doors already propped wide open in the morning heat, past the land office and the small white church at the far end of the street. A few people looked up. A woman in a yellow dress paused on the boardwalk and shielded her eyes. 2 old men playing checkers on a barrel turned their heads. Della kept her expression exactly neutral, the way she had trained herself to do in new towns, because she had learned that a woman traveling alone invited one of 2 responses in the West: pity or suspicion, and she wanted neither one. She found the blacksmith shop at the south end of town, identified it easily by the ring of hammer on anvil and the smell of hot iron riding on the morning air. She dismounted in the yard and led Patience through the wide open doors into the dim interior. The man inside was working with his back to her, shoulders moving in a steady, powerful rhythm as he shaped a piece of metal against the anvil. He was tall, broad across the back, wearing a leather apron dark with work and sweat. His hair was dark brown and cut short, and when he turned at the sound of her boots on the dirt floor, she saw that he was younger than she had expected, perhaps 28 or 29, with a strong jaw and pale gray eyes that caught the light from the forge in a way that was startling, like looking at the sky just before a change in weather. He looked at her with those eyes for exactly 1 moment before he looked at Patience, which told her something good about him right away. "Shoe," he said. "Left foreleg," she said. He nodded, set his hammer down, and wiped his hands on a rag he pulled from his apron pocket. He came around the anvil and crouched beside Patience, lifting the mare's leg with a practiced ease that the horse accepted without any fuss at all, which told Della something good about him too. Animals trusted the right people. "Lost it clean," he said. "Doesn't look like she picked up any stone bruising. You're lucky." "I have been told that before," Della said, in a tone that made very clear she did not entirely agree with the assessment. He glanced up at her from his crouch, something crossing his face that might have been the beginning of a smile. He stood, reached his hand across Patience's back. "Nelson Fletcher," he said. She looked at his hand for a moment, a habit, checking for rings, checking for threat, and then shook it. "Della Wilcox. Passing through, Miss Wilcox. That is generally what I do." He nodded again, that same slow, unhurried nod, as if her answer made perfect sense and required no further commentary. She appreciated that more than she could have explained to anyone. "I can have her shod by noon," he said. "You can leave her here and come back. I will wait if it is all the same to you. Suit yourself." He gestured toward a wooden stool set against the wall beside a water bucket and a crooked shelf that held a coffee tin and 2 mismatched cups. "There is coffee. It is not good coffee, but it is hot." She poured herself a cup and sat on the stool and watched him work. He moved with a kind of quiet competence that she found calming in a way she could not quite put words to. The steady ring of his hammer, the hiss of hot metal in water, The way he spoke to patients in low, murmured words while he fitted and trimmed and nailed. The coffee was genuinely terrible, bitter and overboiled and thick as mud, and she drank every drop of it. By the time he was finished, her 43 cents had become 31 because he charged her 12 cents for the shoe, which was less than he could have charged, and they both knew it. She tucked the coins back into her pocket and gathered Patience's reins. "There is a boarding house 2 streets over," Nelson Fletcher said, not looking up from where he was cleaning his tools. "Mrs. Hargrove runs it. Clean rooms, clean sheets. She charges 50 cents a night, but she does not ask too many questions." Della Wilcox stood in the doorway of the blacksmith's shop with the hot New Mexico sun falling in golden sheets across the yard and the dry air smelling of dust and juniper and hot iron, and she told herself firmly that she was going to thank him, walk out of this town, and keep riding west. She told herself that very clearly. How would she feel about a horse in the yard? She asked instead. He did look up then, and that beginning of a smile from before came all the way to completion, and it rearranged his whole face into something that Della Wilcox had not been expecting, something warm and genuine and terribly, inconveniently attractive. "She has a small stable," he said. "I built it for her 3 years ago. It will hold 2 horses. Della looked out at the street, looked back at him, looked down at Patience, who was standing with her newly shod hoof resting easy on the ground, the very picture of contentment. "1 night," Della said. "Of course," said Nelson Fletcher. "She stayed for 3. Mrs. Hargrove's boarding house was exactly as advertised. A white-painted 2-story building with a porch that caught the evening breeze, clean rooms with thin cotton curtains that moved in that same breeze, and a landlady who served a hot supper every evening at 6 and did indeed ask very few questions. She was a stout woman in her 60s with iron-gray hair and sharp brown eyes, and when Della came down to supper that first evening, Mrs. Hargrove looked her up and down once, set a plate of beans and salt pork and corn bread in front of her, and said, "You look like you have been eating trail dust for a week." "About that," Della agreed. "There is a bathhouse behind the general store. Marta charges 2 cents and provides the soap." "Thank you, Mrs. Hargrove." "You are welcome, Miss Wilcox." That was the full extent of the personal questions, and Della ate the best meal she had had in 6 weeks in peace. There were 2 other boarders at the table that evening, a territorial surveyor named Mr. Amos, who was mapping land grants in the area, and a young schoolteacher named Clara Bright, who had come out from Ohio the previous spring, and was still getting used to the fact that everything in New Mexico was brown. Mr. Amos talked about geology. Clara asked Della cautious, friendly questions about where she had traveled, and Della answered carefully, giving enough to seem like a sociable person and nothing more than that. She did not sleep well the first night. She never slept well in new places, always lying half awake with one ear tuned to the sounds of the house, the creak of the stairs, the movement outside the window. She had been sleeping that way for 2 years, ever since she had packed one bag and walked out of a house in St. Louis in the gray pre-dawn hours of a March morning in 1880, and begun moving west without stopping to count the cost. She did not like thinking about St. Louis. She thought about it anyway, the way you touch a sore tooth with your tongue despite knowing better, lying in the thin gray light of a Tuesday morning in Harlan Creek, New Mexico territory, 2 years and more than 1,000 miles from the life she had abandoned. His name had been Franklin Wilcox, and he had been her husband, and he had been the kind of man who was perfectly charming to every person in the world except the one who knew him best. She had married him at 22 because she was a minister's daughter from St. Louis, who had been raised to understand that a woman's purpose lived in a good marriage and a well-run household and the proper raising of children. And Franklin Wilcox at 28 had seemed to embody every quality her upbringing had told her to value: steady employment, respectable family, a handsome face, and a voice that could convince a person of almost anything. It had taken her 2 years of marriage to understand that a voice that could convince a person of almost anything was not always a good thing. It had taken her another year to stop blaming herself for not seeing it sooner. And it had taken one specific night in March of 1880, when Franklin had made clear in no uncertain terms that her running was not something he intended to permit, to convince her that she had to leave not just the marriage but the city, not just the city but the state, not just the state but everything familiar. She had not filed for divorce. She did not know if she could. She was not entirely certain of the legal particulars in every territory she had passed through, and she had learned quickly that a woman traveling alone attracted enough attention without adding the word divorce to the conversation. So she rode west under her own name, because she had kept it for the simple practical reason that Della was a known quantity, and she could not afford the confusion of becoming someone else, and she told herself that as long as she kept moving, none of it could catch her. The trouble was that she had turned 27 in April, and she was tired. Not tired of moving exactly. More tired of the particular loneliness of moving, the loneliness of towns that existed only as stopping points, of people who existed only as transactions, of never looking at a piece of horizon, and thinking that there was something on the far side of it that was meant for her specifically. She was thinking about this, lying in the thin gray light, when she heard the sound of the hammer start up again at the blacksmith's shop 2 streets over, and for some reason the sound was comforting in a way that frightened her slightly. She got up, washed her face, and went down to breakfast. The second day in Harlan Creek she walked the town properly, the way she had taught herself to do in every town, learning the exits, the water source, the fastest route to the stable. And then, because the exits and the water source and the route to the stable had taken less than 20 minutes, and the morning was still long and cool, she walked to the general store and spent 8 of her remaining 31 cents on a small bag of coffee beans and a tin of peaches. Because she had been craving peaches for 3 weeks, the general store was run by a man named Mr. Torres and his wife, Elena, a Mexican couple who had been in Harlan Creek since before the town had a name, or so Elena told her while wrapping up the coffee beans in brown paper. Elena was a small, bright-eyed woman in her 40s who moved behind her counter with the efficient energy of someone who had been working since before sunrise and intended to continue until well after dark, and she looked at Della with the particular shrewd warmth of a woman who could read a story in another person's face and had decided, at least provisionally, to like what she saw. "You are staying at Mrs. Hargrove's?" Elena asked. "Yes." "Good. Did Nelson Fletcher shoe your horse?" Della blinked slightly at the leap. "He did. He does good work," Elena said, without particular emphasis, but her eyes were bright. "He has been here 4 years now, came from Colorado, good man." She said it the way people said things when they mean considerably more than the words they are actually speaking. "That is good to know," Della said, and kept her own voice very even. Elena handed her the brown paper parcel with a smile that suggested she was not remotely fooled. On the way back to the boarding house, Della passed the blacksmith's shop. She had not intended to stop. She did not stop, technically. She did slow to a walk, and she did look in through the open doors, and she did see Nelson Fletcher at work at the anvil again, his sleeves rolled to the elbow, a length of iron glowing orange in the tongs, and he looked up at precisely the moment she was looking in, and they regarded each other for 1 full second across the distance of the yard before she walked on. She ate the tin of peaches on the boarding house porch that afternoon and tried to think about the road west and thought about gray eyes instead. On the evening of the second day, something happened that she had not anticipated, which was that she began to talk to Nelson Fletcher. It started simply enough. She had come to the stable to check on Patience, as she did every evening, and found him there as well, doing something with the hinges on the stable door. He had his tools spread out on the ground beside him, and he was frowning at the door with the focused expression of a man who had taken on a small repair job and intended to do it properly. "Mrs. Hargrove asked me to fix it," he said, without preamble, when he heard her footsteps. "Has been sticking since spring." "It does stick," Della confirmed. She went past him to Patience's stall, checked the water, ran her hand along the mare's neck. Patience turned her head and pressed her nose against Della's shoulder in the way she had always done, ever since Della had bought her from a Comanche trader named Spotted Horse on the banks of the Red River in the summer of 1880. "She trusts you," Nelson said. He was watching from the doorway, wrench in hand. "We have been through a good deal together," Della said. "Where did you start from?" She turned at that. It was the question everyone wanted to ask, and most people in the West had the manners not to, and she looked at him steadily for a moment, measuring. "Missouri," she said. It was the truth, just not the entire truth. He nodded. "Long road." "Yes." He went back to the hinge. She stayed with Patience. The late evening light came in through the high small window of the stable in a shaft of warm gold, and the horses moved quietly in their stalls, and somewhere outside a nighthawk began its descending call, and Della Wilcox stood in the half-dark and felt, for the first time in a very long time, something that was not exactly peace but was something in the same neighborhood. "What brought you to Harlan Creek?" she asked. She had not meant to ask it. It came out anyway. He sat back on his heels, considering the hinge. "Came down from Colorado after the silver camp. I was working dried up. I had a trade and I had a little saved. Mr. Torres mentioned the town had no smith." He paused. "It is a good place, quiet. People mostly leave each other to their own business." "That is a quality I value in a place," she said. He looked at her again, that steady, unhurried regard. "I thought it might be." There was no sharpness in it, no prying. It was simply an observation, offered and then left alone, and Della found that she did not know quite what to do with a man who could see something and then simply leave it alone. She said good night and went in. She slept somewhat better than the night before. On the morning of the third day, she saddled Patience and stood in the yard of the boarding house with her bag strapped behind the saddle, ready to ride. Mrs. Hargrove came out with a wrapped parcel of corn bread for the road. Clara Bright came to the window and waved. Della thanked them both and turned Patience toward the street. She rode as far as the edge of town, where the street became a trail and the trail bent west into the basin lands, flat and wide and dry and utterly indifferent, stretching toward the far blue line of mountains that sat on the horizon like a promise nobody had specifically made. She stopped there for a long moment. She told herself she was checking the strap on her saddlebag. This was not true. She turned Patience around and rode back down the street, past the church, past the land office, past the saloon, and stopped in front of the blacksmith's shop. Nelson Fletcher was in the yard, loading a delivery of iron stock from a wagon. He looked up when she stopped. He did not look surprised exactly, but there was something in his expression that was, she searched for the word, careful. Hopeful but careful about being hopeful, which was something she understood completely. "I was wondering," she said, keeping her voice steady, "whether you might know of any work in this town, temporary work. I am capable with figures, I can read and write well, I can sew, and I have some experience in managing household supplies." He looked at her for a moment. "Mrs. Hargrove mentioned last week that she has been managing the boarding house accounts herself since her daughter left for Santa Fe, and she does not have a head for numbers. I believe she finds it frustrating." Della thought about her 31 cents, now reduced to 23. She thought about the road west, flat and empty and endless. She looked at the mountains on the horizon. "I will speak to her," she said. "That seems like a good idea," Nelson Fletcher said, in the tone of a man who is being very careful not to smile too broadly. "Mrs. Hargrove hired her on the spot. 20 cents a week in addition to room and board, in exchange for managing the boarding house accounts, helping with the marketing, and doing 3 hours of mending every afternoon since Mrs. Hargrove's eyesight was beginning to fail in the close work. It was not a fortune. It was not nothing. "You will stay in the room you have," Mrs. Hargrove said, as if this was simply a practical arrangement and not an act of pointed generosity. "I will not have you moving to that smaller one just to save me money. The smaller one is drafty." "Thank you, Mrs. Hargrove," Della said. "You are a sensible woman," Mrs. Hargrove said. "This town has room for sensible women." Della did not cry. She was out of practice at crying, had been for about 18 months. But she stood in the kitchen of the boarding house with the account books in her hands and felt something open in her chest that had been very tightly shut for a very long time. The weeks that followed settled into a rhythm that Della had not expected to find comfortable and found deeply so. She was up at dawn, helped with the morning meal, spent the morning hours on the accounts and marketing, which included regular visits to Tor's general store, where Alina would talk to her with the friendly volubility of a woman who had been starved for good female conversation and was making up for lost time. In the afternoons she mended, sitting on the boarding house porch where the breeze came through, and in the evenings she took Patience out for a ride on the Basin Trail, and some evenings on her way back she would stop at the edge of the blacksmith's yard. This was how it began, the stopping. She would pause at the edge of the yard and they would talk about small things, the weather, the progress of a particular piece of work he was doing, what she had heard in town, what books were available at the small lending shelf in the back of Tor's general store. He read, which surprised her and then didn't, because she had already understood that he was a man of more interior depth than was immediately apparent. He was working his way through a volume of Tennyson that Mr. Torrs had gotten with a box lot of goods from a passing trader, reading it in the evenings when the shop was done. "Do you like it?" she asked him one evening, leaning against the fence post at the edge of the yard. He considered this with his usual thoughtfulness. "Some of it. There is a line I keep coming back to. I am a part of all that I have met. That one stays with me." She looked at him in the fading light. The sun was going down behind the mountains, and the sky was going from gold to rose to that deep particular blue of the desert evening, and a warm wind was moving through the yard and lifting dust in small spirals. And Nelson Fletcher was looking at her with those gray eyes that caught the light so unexpectedly, and she thought, with a clarity that was almost frightening, that she understood exactly why that line stayed with him. "That is a good line," she said. "I thought you might think so," he said. She pushed herself off the fence post. "I should go in." "Of course." She walked 2 steps and stopped. Without turning around she said, "I would like to borrow it when you are finished. The Tennyson." "It will be waiting for you," he said, and his voice was warm and steady and unhurried, the same as always, and she walked back to the boarding house with something she was not yet prepared to name turning over in her chest. Summer deepened into the particular fierce heat of August in the territory, where the sun hit the basin lands like a hammer and the air tasted of dry earth, and the occasional distant smell of rain that never quite arrived. The town of Harlan Creek went about its business in the somewhat slower tempo of the heat, fewer people on the streets in the middle of the day, more voices in the cool of the saloon and the general store, the rhythm of life adjusted around the implacable fact of the sun. On the 4th Sunday of August, there was a small catastrophe at the boarding house, which was that Mr. Amos, the surveyor, left suddenly for Albuquerque in the early morning and took with him, apparently by accident, the leather folio in which Della kept the boarding house accounts. He was not a dishonest man. It became clear immediately that he had simply mistaken the folio for his own surveying notes in the confusion of a hasty departure. But the result was the same. The accounts for July were somewhere on the road to Albuquerque, and Della spent the better part of the day reconstructing them from memory, and from her own meticulous habit of making notes in a small personal journal she kept in her room. By early afternoon she had the bulk of it done, but her shoulders ached from hunching over the table, and her right hand was cramped from writing, and she was sitting on the porch steps trying to work the stiffness out of her fingers when she heard boots on the path and looked up to find Nelson Fletcher standing at the gate. He had cleaned up, good shirt, hair combed, hat in hand, and he looked slightly nervous, which she had not previously seen on him and which was, against all expectation, absolutely charming. "I heard about the account books," he said, "from Alina. I wanted to make sure everything was all right." "It will be," she said. "I had most of it in my journal." He nodded. remained at the gate. She looked at him. "Would you like to sit down?" she said. He came through the gate and sat beside her on the porch steps at a respectable distance, hat on his knee. For a moment they were both quiet, and the afternoon lay around them easy and golden, and a mockingbird in the elm tree at the corner of the yard was going through its entire repertoire with the dedicated energy of an animal that had all the time in the world. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "You can try," she said. "You have been here 6 weeks," he said. "You are good at your work, Mrs. Hargrove says you are the best thing that has happened to the boarding house since indoor plumbing," which was her exact phrase. "The people here like you." He paused. "Do you think about leaving?" It was the most direct he had been in 6 weeks of careful, circling conversation, and the directness of it made her chest tight. She looked at the mockingbird in the elm tree. She thought about the road west, still out there, still running toward those blue mountains, still waiting. "I think about it," she said honestly. He was quiet for a moment, then, "I am not asking you to stay, I just want to understand." She looked at him. He was looking back at her steadily, no performance in it, no pressure, just that genuine gray-eyed attention that she had come to depend on more than she had meant to. "I have been moving west for 2 years," she said. "Before that I was in a place I did not choose to be in. I have been—" She stopped, choosing words carefully. "I have been afraid of stopping, because stopping meant someone could find me, and being found meant going back." He did not fill the silence with questions. He waited. "I am not certain that is still true," she said slowly. "That stopping is dangerous. I am not certain of much, honestly. But I know that this is the first place in 2 years where I have woken up in the morning and not immediately started calculating the fastest route to the next town." He was very still. "What changed?" She looked at him for a long moment. This man who was patient and honest and gentle and strong, who had looked at her horse before he looked at her, and who read Tennyson in the evenings, and who had told her, in 6 weeks of conversation, more about himself than she had learned about Franklin Wilcox in 3 years of marriage, told her without drama or performance, just the plain matter of his life offered freely, his years in the silver camps in Colorado. His father, who had been a blacksmith before him and died when Nelson was 19 and left him the tools and the trade. His sister in Denver, who wrote letters every month. His belief, stated simply and without apology, that a person ought to try to do honest work and treat other people decently and let that be enough. "I am not certain I want to say," she said. He nodded. He looked down at his hat on his knee. After a moment he said very quietly, "I am not going anywhere, Della. I want you to know that, whatever you decide." The use of her first name, easy and natural as if he had been saying it for years, landed in the middle of her chest like a warm hand pressed flat against her breastbone. She said, "Thank you, Nelson," and the use of his name was a small door opening. He looked up and those gray eyes found hers and held them, and for one long suspended moment in the golden August afternoon everything was very clear and very simple. And then Della Wilcox, who had been running for 2 years and had forgotten what it felt like to stand still, felt herself stop. Not give up, not surrender, stop, the way a person stops at the edge of something beautiful before stepping into it. "I should finish the accounts," she said. "Of course," he said. He stood and put his hat on and went back down the path to the gate. At the gate he turned back and said, "Sunday afternoon after church, there is usually a gathering at the Tor's place. Alina cooks. It is informal. You might enjoy it if you are not busy." "I might come," she said. He smiled then, that full warm smile that rearranged his face, and touched the brim of his hat and walked back up the street toward his shop. And Della sat on the boarding house porch steps for another 5 minutes listening to the mockingbird, and deciding she was going to need to be very careful, and then deciding, with a kind of tired, exasperated recognition, that being very careful had not kept her safe before, and was probably not going to be her primary strategy going forward. She went to the Tor's gathering on Sunday. Alina had made tamales and a pot of chili and a stack of corn tortillas, and there were perhaps 15 people gathered in the yard behind the general store in the long blue shadow of the afternoon, some of whom Della knew by now. Clara Bright, looking pinker and more cheerful than usual. a rancher named Gus Whitfield who had a good laugh and terrible taste in jokes, a quiet Navajo man named Charlie who worked at the livery stable and whose English was excellent, and whose patience for Gus Whitfield's jokes was clearly hard-won, and some she was just meeting. Nelson was there already when she arrived, talking to Charlie, and when he saw her come through the gate something in his whole posture eased in a way that was gratifyingly obvious. He brought her a plate of food, because both his hands were free and hers were occupied with Patience's reins from the short ride over, and the naturalness of this small gesture was not lost on her or on Alina, who watched it happen from her position beside the tamale pot with an expression of profound satisfaction. They sat together in the shade of a cottonwood tree and ate and talked, and later they moved to where Clara Bright was teaching a card game she had brought from Ohio that nobody else knew, and that turned out to be complicated and slightly ridiculous and made everyone laugh. Nelson had a good laugh. She noticed deep and genuine, not the performed laugh of a man who wanted to seem likable, but the real one, the one that came from actually finding something funny. She made a joke about the rules of the card game, and he turned his head and laughed at it, and then caught her eye in the private way of someone sharing a joke between just the two of them, and her heart did something she had not given it permission to do. Alina cornered her later, while Nelson was in conversation with Gus Whitfield about some business with a wagon wheel repair. "You see," Alina said, filling Della's cup with coffee, "I told you he was a good man." "Alina," Della said. "I am not saying anything," Alina said, with the expression of a woman who is saying everything. "You are very obviously saying something." "I am saying he is a good man who has been alone for 4 years and who has smiled more in the past 6 weeks than I have seen him smile in the previous 4 months. She handed Della the coffee cup. "I am only making an observation." Della looked across the yard to where Nelson was now demonstrating something about a wagon wheel mechanism to Gus using his hands, animated and patient, his hat pushed back on his head, and she thought about what Alina had said and felt the full complex weight of it. "I am not a simple situation," Della said quietly. Alina's expression softened. "Nobody in this territory is a simple situation, Mija. That is the whole point of coming west. To become something different." Della thought about that for a long time that night. In September, a man came to Harlan Creek. He arrived on a Wednesday on the eastbound stage from Albuquerque, a compact man in a dark coat with a city quality about him that sat oddly in the territory dust, and he checked into the only hotel in town, which was a 3-room establishment run by a widower named Hollins above his own dry goods store. He gave his name as Reeves at the hotel and at the saloon and asked, as if idly, whether anyone knew a woman named Della Wilcox. He did not ask at Mrs. Hargrove's boarding house, but Mrs. Hargrove heard about it from Alina by Thursday morning, and Alina told Della by Thursday noon, and Della sat in the boarding house kitchen with the account book open in front of her and a cup of tea going cold beside her hand, and felt the cold, familiar weight of the thing she had been running from settle back across her shoulders. She did not panic. She had stopped panicking some months back, had moved through it to a quieter, harder kind of resolve. She thought clearly. She considered her options. She could ride out today, be across the basin by dark, be over the mountains by the following week. She could disappear again. She was good at disappearing. She sat with that option for a while. Then she thought about the boarding house porch in the morning. She thought about Clara Bright and her card games and Alina's tamales and Mrs. Hargrove's sharp brown eyes and her genuine warm heart. She thought about Patience, well-fed and rested and content in a good stable for the first time in 2 years. She thought about Nelson Fletcher at the gate saying, "I'm not going anywhere, Della." She closed the account book. She put on her coat and her hat. She walked to the blacksmith's shop. He was in the yard, measuring iron stock. He looked up when she came through the gate and read something in her face immediately, because he was that kind of man. "What has happened?" he said. "There is a man in town asking after me," she said. She met his eyes. "I expect he has been sent by my husband." There was a pause. She watched his face work through this information, the word husband, the full weight of what it meant about her situation and her 2 years of traveling and the particular shape of the thing she had been running from. She had told him some of it in pieces in their evening conversations, never the whole picture, always just enough. He had listened and had not asked for more than she offered. "Are you in danger?" he said. His voice was very level. "I do not think so. Franklin wants to know where I am." "I do not believe he would send a man to physically harm me." She said this carefully because it was what she believed and not entirely what she could be certain of. "But he will report back to St. Louis, and then Franklin will know where I am, and then you will feel as if you need to run again," Nelson said. "Yes," she looked at him. "I wanted you to know, before I decided anything." He set down the iron stock. He came and stood in front of her, close enough that she could see the detail of his expression clearly, that serious, steady regard. "What are you going to do?" "I do not know yet," she said honestly. "I think I need to understand what my legal position actually is." "The marriage, whether he has any claim," she paused. "I have been afraid to ask anyone all this time because asking meant acknowledging it was real." Nelson was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Judge Hartwell comes through Harlan Creek every other month on his circuit. He is due in 3 weeks. He is a fair man. Alina would confirm it." He paused again. "In the meantime, the man asking questions is staying at Hollins's hotel, not at the boarding house. You have not been found yet, not definitively." He asked at the saloon, not at every door. She looked at him. "You are telling me I have 3 weeks." "I am telling you that you have time to make a decision that is yours instead of one that is forced on you," he said. "I think that matters." She felt something break open inside her, not painfully, but with the release of something under tremendous pressure for a very long time. The thing that had been running west for 2 years, running because it had to, running because it did not know how to stop. It looked at Nelson Fletcher and recognized, with a certainty she had not felt since before she understood what certainty cost, that he was worth stopping for. "I need to think," she said. "Of course." She walked back to the boarding house and she thought. She thought all through Thursday afternoon and Thursday evening, through a sleepless hour in the middle of the night, through the gray of Friday morning. She thought about the law, what she knew of it, which was limited, the Married Women's Property Acts that had been moving through various states, the fact that divorce was possible in many territories, the fact that she had not been physically detained and had not abandoned a household in the technical sense because Franklin Wilcox himself had made that household untenable, in ways that she had never told anyone, in ways she had carried alone because she had believed, for a long time, that no one would believe her, or that, even if they believed her, it would not be enough to matter. On Friday afternoon, she went to find the man named Reeves. She found him at the saloon at the corner table, drinking very slowly in the manner of a man who is taking up space and waiting. He was perhaps 40, with careful eyes. When she sat down across from him without invitation, those careful eyes reassessed her immediately, which meant Franklin had not told him quite what to expect. "Miss Wilcox," he said. "Mrs. Wilcox," she said, and then heard herself say it and made a decision. "Or rather, I would prefer Miss Wilcox, and you may tell Mr. Wilcox that you found me, and that I am well, and that I will be consulting with the circuit judge when he arrives in 3 weeks about my legal options, and that any further interference in my business will be addressed through those same legal channels." She kept her voice completely steady. "You may also tell him that I will not be returning to St. Louis." Reeves looked at her for a long moment. Whatever he had expected from this assignment, it was clear it had not been this. "You understand I am required to report back," he said. "I expect nothing less," she said. "Report whatever you need to. But understand that I intend to remain in Harlan Creek, and that the people of this town are aware of the situation, and that this territory has a judge who will be here in 3 weeks. She held his gaze. "Good afternoon, Mr. Reeves." She walked out of the saloon into the bright afternoon sun on legs that were completely steady, which surprised her, and stood for a moment with her hands folded and her face tipped up to the warmth of the sun, and felt, with enormous surprised clarity, that she was not afraid. Mr. Reeves was on the eastbound stage the following Monday morning. She told Nelson about the conversation that evening at the fence post, and watched the particular expression that moved across his face, something that was relief and admiration in equal measure, and something else that was deeper and quieter. "You did that yourself," he said. "You went to him." "I thought it was better than running," she said. "It was braver," he said simply. She looked at him in the fading evening light, the pink and gold sky above the mountains, the warm, steady presence of him. "I have been running for a long time," she said. "I am tired of it. Not of the West. I love the West. I love the space of it and the light of it, but the running itself. I am very tired of that." "Then stop," he said. It was not a command or a plea, just a statement of possibility offered gently like a hand in the dark. "I am working on it," she said. He smiled. She smiled back. It was, she thought, an entirely different kind of smile than any she had deployed in the past 2 years, not the careful, polite smile of a woman managing strangers, but something real and unguarded and private just for him. 3 weeks later, Judge Hartwell arrived in Harlan Creek on a dusty gray horse with 2 saddlebags full of legal documents, and the air of a man who had been dispensing frontier justice for 20 years, and had seen most of what there was to see. He was a spare, white-haired man in his late 60s, with an unexpectedly kind manner and a reputation, as Alina had confirmed, for genuine fairness. Della had an appointment with him the morning after his arrival, which Nelson had helped her arrange by word through the land office. She brought the account of her marriage and her departure, set down carefully in writing the night before, clear and factual and complete, including the things she had never told anyone before, the full shape of what Franklin Wilcox had been, not just the public charm and the private cruelty, but the specific instances, the particular history that she had carried in silence because she had believed that silence was safer than the truth. Judge Hartwell listened. He read. He asked several careful questions. He was quiet for a long time. "You left the marital home of your own volition," he said, "but you did so under conditions of documented fear and ongoing harm." He paused. "The law in this territory will permit a divorce petition on grounds of cruelty and abandonment, in the sense that the conditions he created constituted a form of moral abandonment of his duties. I will not pretend this is simple or quick, but it is possible. And a woman who has lived openly under her own name in a town for 2 months, who has employment and community ties, is in a considerably stronger legal position than one who has been hiding." He looked at her steadily. "Are you certain?" "I have never been more certain of anything in my life," Della said. He took down her statement and initiated the paperwork, and told her it would take several months to process through the proper channels, and that she should expect Franklin Wilcox to contest it, and that she should maintain her residence and her position in the community and document everything. "I intend to," she said. She walked out of the land office into the October morning, a morning of bright, clean sky after a recent rain, and the whole town was washed golden, and the air smelled of damp earth and sage, and somewhere nearby someone was baking bread. And she stood on the boardwalk with the paperwork in her hands and took a long, slow breath all the way down to the bottom of her lungs. She found Nelson at the shop. She told him what the judge had said. He listened to all of it, and when she was done he said, "How do you feel?" She thought about it. "Terrified," she said, "and relieved in equal amounts." "That sounds about right," he said. He was looking at her with that expression she had come to know well by now, the one he had been careful with, the one he kept close, the one that was something more than friendship and something he had not yet said aloud, waiting with the same patient restraint he brought to everything. The October air moved between them. The forge was going behind him, and the heat of it reached her at the edge of the yard. "Nelson," she said. "Yes," he said. "I should tell you something," she said. "I should have told you sooner, but I was not ready, and I am not entirely sure I am ready now, but I think I will tell you anyway." He waited, absolutely still. "I think I stopped running," she said, "some time ago, and I think the reason I stopped is you." She held his gaze. "I'm not saying that to put something on you. I am saying it because it is true and because I am finished not saying true things. You are kind and honest and patient, and you make me feel safe, in a way I had forgotten was possible. And I think about you considerably more than is probably appropriate for two people who have not yet said anything." He crossed the yard in 3 strides, which was not a small yard, and she had about half a second to register that he was moving before he was in front of her, close enough that she had to tip her head back slightly to meet his eyes, which were more intensely gray than she had ever seen them, and he said, low and direct, "I have been in love with you since the morning you walked into my shop and offered the worst handshake I have ever received from a woman." She laughed. She had not expected to laugh, and it surprised them both. "That is not romantic." "It is the truth," he said, and the laughter settled and they were close and serious, and the world was very still around them, and he said, "Can I?" and she said, "Yes." And he put his hands on her face the way you hold something precious that you have been afraid of breaking, and he kissed her in the October light in the middle of the blacksmith's yard, and it was the simplest and most profound thing that had happened to her in a very long time. It was the kind of kiss that was not a question but also not an answer, just a beginning, warm and tender and very real, like someone taking your hand in the dark and saying, "Here, I have you." She leaned into it. She let herself. When they separated, she was aware of 3 things simultaneously: that her heart was going very fast, that his hands were still warm on her face, and that Alina Torres was passing by on the boardwalk across the street and was definitely not pretending not to see them. "Alina," Della said. Nelson turned and looked. Alina raised one hand in a wave of enormous satisfaction and walked on without slowing. Della laughed again, helplessly, and Nelson's forehead came down against hers, and they stood like that, laughing together in the yard, and it was the finest thing. The months that followed were many things at once. They were the months of paperwork and waiting, and the process of legal dissolution that moved with the particular slow, grinding pace of territorial law, complicated by the fact that Franklin Wilcox did indeed contest the petition, through a lawyer in St. Louis, in a series of letters that arrived via the land office addressed to Judge Hartwell. Della read the lawyer's letters when the judge shared them with her, and they were full of formal language that added up to the claim that she had been a difficult wife who had abandoned a good husband, and she read them and felt the old anger and the old shame, and then, very deliberately, set both of them down and told Judge Hartwell what was true with documentation and waited. The months were also this. Nelson. They were long evenings on the boarding house porch with the autumn coming in across the basin, the air going crisp and clean, the mountains changing from brown to early snow white on their peaks. They were Sunday afternoons at the Torres place, and long rides out on the basin trail and conversations that went from small things to large ones and back again without any effort at all. They were the Tennyson book, which she read and returned with 3 pages of marginal notes in pencil, and he read her notes, and they argued about 2 of them with great enjoyment. She moved through the days of that fall with a new quality of attention, as if the world had come into a focus she had not had for years. She noticed everything, the particular amber of the late afternoon light on the main street, the way the cottonwood trees along the creek bed went gold and then bare, the sound of the hammer from the blacksmith's shop that she could hear from the boarding house porch, and that she had stopped hearing as simply noise and started hearing as something that meant something to her specifically. She was happy. The discovery of this fact was itself a kind of discovery, like finding a room in a house you had been living in for years that you had not known was there. Nelson was careful with her, not in the way of a man walking on eggshells, but in the way of a man who understood that care was itself a form of love. He did not push, never pushed, was simply and entirely present in a way that she had come to understand was rarer than she had known. He was attentive to the days when the waiting for the legal resolution was difficult, and she was quiet with the weight of it, And on those days he would come to the boarding house with some small thing, a piece of work he had done that was interesting, a question about one of her account books, a simple presence, and sit with her in the quiet and not require anything of it. And on the days when she was not quiet with the weight of it, she was good with him. She was better with him than she had been with anyone in a very long time, lighter and more herself, quicker to laugh, more willing to argue about something and then laugh about arguing about it, more willing to say exactly what she thought because she had learned that he would not use what she thought against her. December brought the cold and the particular stunning clarity of a clear New Mexico night, the stars so thick and bright above the dark basin lands that the first time she stood in the yard and saw them full on after a cloudy week, she said, involuntarily, "Oh," and Nelson, who was standing beside her, heard it and looked at her face looking up at the sky and smiled at something he did not say. She turned and caught him looking. "What?" "Nothing," he said. "I just like seeing things through your eyes." She looked back at the stars. "That is a very good line," she said. "I thought you would think so," he said, which was what he had said about the Tennyson line in the summer, and they both remembered it at the same moment and looked at each other. And it was one of those moments that accumulated between them, the long continuous thread of shared history that was becoming the fabric of something permanent. On a January evening in 1883, she had supper with him at the rooming house Mrs. Hargrove had extended an invitation to Nelson for supper several weeks running by this point, with the matter-of-fact warmth of a woman who had made her opinion clear through practical action. And after supper, they sat together on the porch in the cold with blankets around their shoulders and talked, the breath misting in the night air, the stars doing their usual magnificent performance above the basin. He had been quieter than usual all evening, a particular quality of quiet, not sad but gathered as if he was working up to something. She waited. She had learned his timing. "I want to ask you something," he said, "and I want you to know that whatever your answer is, nothing changes. I'm not going anywhere. I told you that and I meant it." "You did," she said. He was looking out at the stars. "When this is done, the legal matter, I would like to court you properly, and I would like it to lead, if you are willing, to something permanent, to marriage." He turned and looked at her directly, which was always how he looked at her, no performance, no deflection, just the plain real thing. "I know that is not a word you have been fond of for good reason. I am not asking you to trust the institution. I am asking you to trust me." The night was very clear and very cold and very still. She could hear the low sound of the wind on the basin far off and the occasional stamp of a horse from the stable. She thought about trust, which was a thing she had taken entirely apart 2 years ago and had been very slowly, carefully building back into something she could use. "I trust you," she said. "I have for some time. I was afraid to say it because I was afraid of what it meant." "What does it mean?" he asked. "It means I am stopping," she said. "Completely. Not pausing, not passing through." "Stopping here with you?" She looked at him. "Yes, Nelson, when it is done. Yes." He took her hand, which was cold from the January night, between both of his, which were warm, and held it. That was all. Just held her hand in both of his in the cold, and they sat together in the blankets under the vast New Mexico stars, and she thought that this was what she had been moving toward, all those miles and all those months, and she could not have found it by looking for it, could only have found it by stopping. The legal dissolution came through in late March of 1883, carried in a letter to Judge Hartwell from the Territorial Court in Santa Fe. Franklin Wilcox's contest had been heard and evaluated and set aside, on the grounds of documented cruelty and the judge's own detailed assessment of the case, and Della Wilcox was legally free. She held the document for a long time at the kitchen table of the boarding house, Mrs. Hargrove sitting across from her with the practical decency of a woman who understood that some things needed to be witnessed but not filled with words. Outside the window, the March morning was doing something the previous August had only threatened, which was that it was actually raining, a real rain, steady and warm, and the street was filling with the smell of wet earth and the air coming in through the kitchen window was green and alive. When she had held it long enough, she folded it carefully and put it in the inside pocket of her coat, next to her heart, not for sentiment, though there was that, but because she was going to take it directly to Nelson, and she did not want to put it down again. She walked to the blacksmith shop in the rain without her hat, which was something she never did, and arrived at the yard gate with her hair going dark with rain and her face wet, and Nelson came to the door of the shop and saw her and stopped. "Della," he said. She crossed the yard and put the document in his hand. He read it. He looked up. "It is done," she said. He came down the steps of the shop into the rain and held her face in his hands and kissed her in the middle of the yard in the rain, and it was completely different from October and entirely the same. A continuation, a deepening, a settling of something into its right place. The rain came down and neither of them moved for quite some time. They were married in June of 1883, a Saturday morning at the small white church at the end of Harlan Creek's Main Street, by the minister who came through on the circuit every 6 weeks. The church was full, which surprised Della and should not have, because she had been in Harlan Creek for nearly a year by then, and had apparently, without entirely meaning to, become part of the fabric of the place. The woman who kept Mrs. Hargrove's accounts and talked to Alina about books and helped Clara Bright with a difficult student that fall, and rode out on the Basin Trail every evening, and had become the reason the blacksmith smiled. Alina cried. Mrs. Hargrove did not cry, but she did press her lips together in a way that was the equivalent. Charlie from the livery stable shook Nelson's hand with the quiet warmth of a man who did not use many words but meant all of them. Gus Whitfield attempted a joke that was not terrible for once. Della wore a dress that Alina and Clara had helped her make from a blue cotton fabric that Mr. Torres had ordered from Albuquerque specifically for this purpose, which was something Alina had arranged in secret, and which Della had discovered 2 weeks before the wedding when she came into the store, and found the bolt of fabric sitting on the counter with a note that said, "In Alina's clear handwriting for your dress, and do not argue with me." She did not argue. Nelson had put on his best clothes, which were not elaborate good dark trousers, a clean white shirt, a jacket he had had since Colorado that fit him well, and he had his hat in his hands at the front of the church, turning it in his fingers the way he had that first Sunday at the boarding house gate, that same careful hope. And when she came down the aisle, he looked at her and stopped turning the hat completely and just looked, with an expression that was nothing but open and certain and wholly glad. She walked toward him and felt with each step the 2 years of running settle and resolve behind her, each mile of it accounted for and necessary, because every step of it had been a step toward this, toward stopping here, in this dry, beautiful territory, in this small, good town, with this man who had looked at her horse before he looked at her and had been patient and honest and worth every mile it had taken to find him. "Hi," she said when she reached him. "Hi," he said and smiled, and the minister cleared his throat and they both laughed and then they got married. The summer of their first year as a married couple was filled with the particular happiness of ordinary things made extraordinary by the presence of the right person, of waking up with the New Mexico sun coming through a window that was now their window, of sharing a table and a fire, and the long evening light on the basin, of building the particular private language of a life shared between two people who had chosen each other with full knowledge of what they were choosing. They moved into a small house that Nelson had been renting on the east side of town, 2 rooms with a good stone fireplace and a porch that faced the mountains, and set about making it theirs with a completeness that delighted Della, who had not owned anything fixed in 3 years, and who put her books on the shelf and her coffee cup on the kitchen table and her boots beside the door and felt, each time, a particular private satisfaction at the rootedness of it. She continued to help Mrs. Hargrove with the accounts, by arrangement, 3 mornings a week, because she was genuinely skilled at it, and because she was fond of Mrs. Hargrove and because the work kept her connected to the town in a way she valued. She had also begun, in the fall of that first year, to do accounting work for 2 other Harlan Creek businesses, Tor's General Store, and a small freighting operation run by a man named Bright, no relation to Clara, who needed someone to manage his billing. It turned out that frontier bookkeeping was a thing she was genuinely good at, which was something she had not known about herself before she needed to be. She told Nelson this one evening, looking at the work spread on the kitchen table, and he looked up from the piece of iron hardware he was examining for a commission and said, with complete naturalness, "You are good at many things." This was always going to reveal itself eventually. He said it the way he said most things, simply and certainly, no flattery in it, just a man stating what he believed to be true about the person he knew best. She threw a dish towel at him. He caught it without looking up, which was irritating. In the spring of 1884, she discovered she was pregnant. She told him on a Sunday morning in April, in the kitchen with the light coming through the window and the coffee on the stove, and his face did something she had not quite anticipated, which was that it went through a full sequence of emotions: shock, then joy, then something that was very close to awe, then joy again, settling finally into a warm certainty that made him look younger and older at the same time. He put his coffee cup down. He came around the table and took her hands and said, "Are you all right? How do you feel?" "I feel well," she said, somewhat uncertain. "Quite happy." "Quite happy," he repeated and smiled. "That is good. Quite happy is very good." She said, "You are going to be an extraordinary father." He looked at her for a moment. Then he pulled her into him and held her, her head against his chest, his arms around her, and she felt the steadiness of him, his heartbeat, his breathing, his absolute uncomplicated presence, and thought that if she had designed from scratch the feeling of being exactly where she was supposed to be, this was precisely what it would feel like. Their son was born in November of 1884, a healthy boy with his father's gray eyes and his mother's determined frown, and they named him James after Nelson's father, a choice that made Nelson very quiet in a way that was full of good feeling rather than grief, a quietness of honoring. James Fletcher was born in the room that had been their bedroom, and was now also his, in a bed that Mrs. Hargrove had sent extra blankets for, attended by the town's doctor, a capable woman named Dr. Reyes, who had come from Mexico City and who treated illness and injury with equal matter-of-fact efficiency, and by Elena, who had appointed herself the unofficial godmother of the event, with the authority of someone who knows precisely where she belongs. Nelson sat beside the bed with his son in his arms and his wife watching him from the pillow, exhausted and absolutely present, and he looked at the small gray-eyed person in his arms with an expression of such complete astonishment and love that Della, who was tired enough to say anything, said, "You look frightened." "I am," he said honestly. "Tremendously." "So am I," she said. They looked at each other over the head of their son. "We will figure it out," she said. "We will figure it out," he agreed. And they did, in the way that all young parents figure it out, imperfectly and tenderly, and with a great deal of help from Elena Torres, who arrived with food every other day for the first month and declared this perfectly normal and expected and not a favor at all. Nelson adapted to fatherhood with the same patient competence he brought to everything, was up at night without complaint, learned the particular art of holding a colicky infant through the small dark hours, walked James up and down the porch in the winter dark until the baby settled. Della watched him and felt the full accumulated warmth of every day since the first one, all of it adding up to this. James was a serious, watchful baby who became a serious, watchful toddler with an early and apparently endless fascination with his father's tools, which Nelson encouraged carefully and in a supervised capacity, keeping the fascinating dangerous things out of reach and offering the fascinating harmless things freely. By the time James was walking, he could often be found sitting in the corner of the blacksmith's shop, watching his father work with the expression of a scholar taking notes. Della's work had expanded by this point. She had 4 regular clients in Harlan Creek and 2 in the neighboring town of Ridgetop, whose residents traveled the 8 miles to Harlan Creek to do business and would stop to see her while they were there. She worked from home in the mornings while Nelson was at the shop, James in a basket or a blanket beside her, later playing on the floor with the collection of wooden shapes Nelson had carved for him over a series of evenings. She had, almost without meaning to, built a small practice, and the work was entirely her skills, her clients, her management, her income. This mattered to her in a way she had not fully been able to articulate until she had it, the particular solidity of a thing she had made herself, that belonged to her specifically, that existed because she was competent and trustworthy and people knew it. "You are becoming the most sought-after bookkeeper in 3 counties," Nelson said one evening, looking over her client list. "2 counties," she corrected. "I do not have anyone from Colfax County yet." "Give it time," he said. She did. By the following spring she had 2 Colfax County clients. Clara Bright got married in the summer of 1885 to a man named Porter who ran the small schoolhouse in Ridgetop and had met Clara at a territorial education meeting in Santa Fe. And Della was at the wedding and cried freely, which she had gotten back in practice with over the past 2 years, and Nelson handed her his handkerchief without being asked, which he was very good at. The town of Harlan Creek changed gradually, as western towns did in those years, grew and shifted as the railroads pressed further into the territory, and the land was homesteaded and mapped and contested and settled. New families arrived. New businesses opened. The small white church got a new roof, funded by a collection that Nelson organized with his usual practical efficiency. The school got a proper building. The road to Ridgetop was graded and improved. Through all of it, the blacksmith's shop at the south end of Main Street continued to ring with the sound of the hammer, a sound that had become so entirely associated with home and rightness in Della's mind that she could hear it now from anywhere in the house and feel immediately settled, the way a particular smell can carry a whole landscape of feeling. In the autumn of 1886, when James was nearly 2 and walking everywhere with the focused determination of someone who has recently discovered that locomotion is possible and intends to maximize this discovery, Della told Nelson that she thought there might be a second one on the way. He received this news with somewhat less shock and somewhat more immediately pure joy than the first time, which seemed right. "A girl this time," he said, with the confidence of a man offering a wish as a prediction. "You do not know that," she said. "I would not be opposed to another James," he said. "I would simply be happy either way." She looked at him across the kitchen table in the evening light, this man she had been married to for 3 years, who was 31 now and had a few early lines at the corners of his eyes from squinting in the forge smoke and the desert light, and who was exactly and precisely himself, no more and no less than what she had seen that first morning in the blacksmith's shop, consistent and warm and absolutely trustworthy. "You are a good man, Nelson Fletcher," she said. He looked back at her with those gray eyes that still caught the light unexpectedly. "I had a good reason to be," he said. It was, she thought, the best answer she had ever heard. The second baby was a girl, born in the spring of 1887, and they named her Ruth, after Della's mother, who had been a kind woman trapped in a narrow life, and who deserved to be remembered by something living. Ruth was entirely unlike James from the first hour, loud and opinionated and full of an energy that seemed to have no natural floor. And the combination of grave, watchful James and raucous, insistent Ruth produced a domestic atmosphere of tremendous personality and frequent noise. Nelson loved it. He was a man, it turned out, who had always wanted a house full of people, having grown up with a father who died too young and a house that had gone too quiet, and the specific quality of the noise his children made James's intent questions, Ruth's imperious demands. The sound of both of them in the yard in the summer evenings was the sound that satisfied something deep in him. Della loved it too. Not in spite of the noise, but because of it, because she had spent a long time in spaces that were silent in the wrong way, silenced rather than quiet, and the noise of children who were entirely free to be themselves was a thing she recognized as precious and would not have traded for anything. They had a dog by this point, a large brown animal of uncertain ancestry that James had discovered under the porch one morning, and that had apparently decided to stay, answering to the name Goliath as if it had always known it. Goliath was deeply attached to Ruth, who treated him as a combination of horse, pillow, and confidant, and he followed her at a patient distance that bore a striking resemblance to the way patients followed Della. Mrs. Hargrove, who was in her late 70s by this time and had slowed considerably, but was still sharp and still ran the boarding house with absolute authority, came to Sunday suppers at their house every week without fail. She sat at the head of the table as a matter of course, because she was the oldest person there and had earned it, and she argued about everything in a way that was entirely affectionate and kept the conversation very lively. Alina and Mr. Torres came frequently. Charlie from the livery came occasionally and always quietly, and always played with the children in a way that suggested he was a man who liked children very much and had simply never made a point of saying so. The thing about Harlan Creek, Della had come to understand, was that it was not simply the place she had stopped. It was the place that had made stopping possible, a community of people who minded their own business with the particular respect of those who understood the value of privacy, and who also showed up with food and hands and presents when things were hard. It was the frontier ethos at its best, stripped of the sentimentalism that Eastern novels applied to it, and expressing what it actually was: a practical generosity, a hardworking decency, a willingness to hold space for people who were still figuring out who they were. She had arrived here with 43 cents and a thrown shoe and 2 years of running in her bones, and she had become someone new in the way that places and people, when they are the right ones, will let you become, not by replacing what was there before but by adding to it, by giving the parts that were always true of you room to expand. She wrote letters sometimes in the evenings to people she had met on the road in those 2 years, a family in Texas who had given her supper one cold night and a place to sleep in their barn, a woman in Tucson who had been running herself and had chosen to stay there instead, a minister in Colorado who had been kind to her without requiring anything of his kindness. The letters were ordinary and full of the details of her life: James's questions, Ruth's opinions, Nelson's work, the mountains in winter, the tamales at the Torres place. And she wrote them with the ease of a woman who had things to report, good things, real things. One evening in the fall of 1888, after supper, after the children were in bed and the house had settled into its evening quiet, she sat on the porch with Nelson and a blanket between them and a pot of coffee on the rail, and the stars doing their extravagant best above the basin. And she thought about a Tuesday morning 6 years ago when she had ridden into this town with 43 cents and a thrown shoe and nothing but the habit of moving. And she looked at the mountains in the dark and at the lighted windows of her house and at the man beside her, and she felt the full accumulated weight of it, not the running, but what the running had been for, what it had been going toward without her. Knowing it, "What are you thinking?" Nelson asked. He had his coffee cup in both hands and he was looking at the stars, and he knew her well enough to know when she was in a particular kind of thinking. "That I would do all of it again," she said, "every mile of it." He turned and looked at her. "Would you? To get here?" "Yes," she looked at him. "I would walk the whole way if I had to." He reached across the blanket and took her hand, the same way he had on that January porch 5 years ago, her hand in both of his. And they sat under the stars in the cool October night with the sound of the basin wind and the distant bark of a coyote and the comfortable dark of the house behind them. And it was everything. She had been 25 the year she ran, a woman with 43 cents and a gray mare and 2 years of motion in her blood. And now she was 33, and she had a home and a husband and 2 children and a dog named Goliath and a bookkeeping practice and a porch that faced the mountains and friends who showed up with food, and the sound of a hammer from a shop 2 streets over that meant everything was all right. She had been running west for 2 years. He had been the first thing worth stopping for, and stopping had given her back to herself, and then, in the way of the best things, had given her everything else. The years settled and deepened in the particular way of a life built on the right foundation, not without difficulty, because nothing was without difficulty, but with the resilience that comes from having chosen carefully and from being chosen in kind. The territory changed around them, became, in 1912, the state of New Mexico, and Harlan Creek changed with it, grew and spread and lost some of its frontier roughness without losing the essential character that had drawn people like Della and Nelson to it in the first place. The light, the space, the blue mountains, the basic decency of people who had come far enough to learn what mattered. Nelson's business grew steadily. He took on an apprentice, a young man from a Navajo family north of town, and taught him the trade with the same patient competence he brought to everything. And the young man, whose name was Thomas, stayed on after his apprenticeship as a partner, because Nelson was the kind of employer who thought in terms of what was right and not simply what was convenient. This arrangement was not universally praised by every resident of Harlan Creek, there being some who held views that Della found contemptible and said so, but Elena Torres and Charlie from the Livery and Mrs. Hargrove were entirely clear in their support, and the weight of decency won out, as it generally does when there are enough people willing to put it on the scale. James grew into a serious, careful boy who showed an early aptitude for the blacksmith's trade, and then, somewhat surprisingly, an equal aptitude for mathematics, which Della recognized as something of a family inheritance and which she cultivated with pleasure, and which eventually led, in ways none of them had anticipated when he was a toddler taking notes in the corner of the shop, to a scholarship to a school in Albuquerque when he was 15. She packed his bag and walked him to the stage with the composed face of a woman who was perfectly fine, and then came home and sat in the kitchen and cried for 20 minutes, after which she dried her face and went back to her bookkeeping. Ruth was an entirely different project. Ruth was 11 when her brother left for school, and had apparently decided that the appropriate response to losing her primary sibling was to triple the amount of personality she deployed on the household, which Della and Nelson navigated with combined exasperation and love. Ruth was funny and ferociously curious and had opinions about everything, and when she was 12, she informed them that she intended to be a doctor like Dr. Ray's, which Dr. Ray's, told about this declaration, said was the best news she had heard in years. Mrs. Hargrove died at 83 with the same matter-of-fact dignity with which she had run her boarding house, on a February morning in her own bed, with Della sitting beside her. She left the boarding house to Clara Bright's daughter, who had grown up in Harlan Creek and was 20 and capable and ready, and she left Della her account books and her good china, which were, Della thought, exactly the right things to leave. Elena and Mr. Torres stayed in Harlan Creek into their own old age, becoming increasingly the bedrock of the town's memory and its warmth, and Sunday suppers continued, modified over the years to include more chairs and more generations, the table expanding year by year to accommodate the particular abundance of people who showed up to be together. And Della and Nelson, in the way of people who have built their life from good materials on honest ground, simply continued. They grew into each other's rhythms and each other's silences and each other's company with a deepening ease, the way a river deepens its bed over time, not because it is carved by force, but because water follows its true course. He still looked at her sometimes, across a room or across the porch in the evening light, with those gray eyes that had stopped her in the blacksmith's yard on the first morning, and she still felt it, not the sharp, startling electricity of the beginning, but something deeper and warmer and permanent, the knowledge that this was the true thing, this person, this life, this place. On their 20th wedding anniversary, June of 1903, Nelson gave her a folded piece of paper at the breakfast table, and she opened it and found in his clear, careful handwriting a line from the Tennyson, I am a part of all that I have met, and underneath it, in his own words, you are the part of me that matters most. Below that, thank you for stopping. She read it twice. She folded it and held it for a moment. She looked up at him across the breakfast table in the morning light. This man she had been married to for 20 years, who was 51 now and had silver at his temples and the permanent tan of a man who worked in desert light, and who was looking at her with the same warm, steady regard that had never once wavered, not in 20 years. Thank you for staying, she said. He smiled, and it was the same smile, the one that rearranged his face, the one she had been seeing since August of 1882 and had never once gotten tired of seeing. James came home from Albuquerque that summer, now a young man with Della's dark hair and his father's gray eyes, and a career in engineering that was already promising, and that would take him eventually to Santa Fe, and then to Denver. But that summer he was home, and it was good. Ruth was 16, and had apparently informed Dr. Reyes that she was available to assist at the office every Saturday, a declaration that Dr. Reyes had received with the practical warmth of someone who knew a future doctor when she saw one. They were all at the Torres place that Sunday in June, the 20th anniversary Sunday, 20 people around Alina's yard in the summer evening light, and Della sat with Nelson on a bench under the cottonwood tree, the same yard, though with 3 more chairs than the first time and a world's worth of accumulated good in between. And she thought, not for the first time, about the woman she had been when she rode into this town. That woman had been brave, and she had been tired, and she had been carrying so much, and she had not known, could not have known, what was waiting for her here. She had ridden in on a gray mare named Patience, looking for a blacksmith, fully intending to keep moving west. She had not needed to keep moving west, as it turned out. She had not needed to go further at all. The thing she had been looking for, not running toward, she had not even known she was looking for it, but looking for nonetheless, had been here, in this dust-brown beautiful town, in a blacksmith's shop, in a tall man with gray eyes who had looked at her horse before he looked at her, and then made her the worst cup of coffee she had ever drunk and asked no unnecessary questions. She had been running west for 2 years. He had been the first thing worth stopping for. And stopping had been, in every way that counted, the bravest and best thing she had ever done. Nelson's hand found hers on the bench without either of them looking, the automatic ease of 20 years of reaching, and she turned her hand in his and held on. And above them, the summer stars were beginning to appear in the deep blue above the mountains, one by one, and Alina was calling from the tamale pot, and Ruth was laughing at something too loud and too freely, and James was asking his father something about iron composition that meant he was trying to explain a technical point, and Goliath III, the current dog, named for the first one in the long chain of large, brown, loyal animals that had apparently decided the Fletcher household was where they belonged, was doing something. In the corner of the yard that was either playing or investigating, it was hard to tell. All of it was right. All of it was theirs. Della Wilcox Fletcher, 33 years past the girl who had started running, held her husband's hand under the New Mexico stars and was entirely at home.